only 1% control their thoughts before 8 a.m. Win your mind first. Stoic Brath reveals how mastering your morning mindset can shape your entire day. Discover simple Stoic strategies to slow your thoughts, reduce mental noise, and build clarity before the world takes control. Learn how one intentional thought can transform your focus, emotions, and decisions. Subscribe now to Stoic Brath for more powerful mindset insights and daily mental clarity. Most people don't lose their day at noon. They lose it in the first few seconds after waking up. Not because they're lazy, not because they lack discipline, but because the very first thoughts they allow into their mind were never consciously chosen. They wake up carrying yesterday's tension, tomorrow's fear, and a mental current already pulling them somewhere they never intended to go. And by the time they become aware of it, they are no longer thinking clearly. They are reacting. That is the danger. And that is exactly what the Stoics understood long before modern life filled our mornings with alarms, screens, and noise. If you do not govern your mind early, your mind will govern you for the rest of the day. There is a quiet moment each morning that most people pass through without ever really seeing. In that moment, everything is still undecided. Your focus is undecided. Your energy is undecided. Even the version of you that will move through the day has not fully taken shape yet. It seems small, almost forgettable, but it holds more power than most people realize. It is the moment where intention can replace impulse. It is the moment where clarity can begin to silence noise. And once you start noticing that, something inside you changes. You begin to understand that control is not something you build later, after stress has already arrived. It is something you claim early, while the mind is still open, still unformed, still waiting for direction. This is the kind of true Stoicism Breath returns to again and again. The battle for the day is often won before the day even begins. Because the way you begin does not just influence your day. It defines it. The tone of your thoughts, the direction of your attention, the emotional weight you carry into your conversations, your work, and your decisions. So much of that is shaped before anything external has even touched you. And if that beginning is left unguarded, then the rest of the day becomes a response to something you never intentionally chose. There is a small gap when you wake up, and almost nobody notices it. It does not feel dramatic. It does not demand attention. That is exactly why it controls so much. Power often hides in the places people ignore. That gap lasts only a few seconds, maybe less. You are not fully thinking yet. You are not fully reacting yet. You are simply there, suspended for a moment between sleep and awareness. Most people pass through that space automatically. They move straight into habit, straight into mental noise, straight into whatever familiar script the mind decides to play first. But that space, that tiny, silent opening, is where control truly lives. Not later in the day, when pressure is already building. Not in the middle of chaos, when emotions are already activated. Right there, in that quiet space before anything is fully formed. Before the mind starts replaying worries. Before it starts collecting stress. Before it rebuilds yesterday's identity and carries it into a new morning, there is silence. Not empty silence. Open silence. The kind of silence that allows something to enter and take shape. And what enters first does not just pass through for a moment and disappear. It settles. It becomes the base layer for everything that follows. Your thinking begins there. Your attention begins there. Your emotional state begins there. And because it happens so fast, most people assume it is random. But it is not random. It is patterned. The first thought often appears automatically, not because it is true, not because it is helpful, but because it is familiar. The mind reaches for what it already knows. Old patterns, old worries, old stories, old identities. It is the same script that has been running quietly in the background for years. The mind does not stop to question it. It simply loads it. And if nothing interrupts that process, the day unfolds along the same track. This is where things begin to split. Not in some dramatic, obvious way, but in a quiet shift that changes direction. If you let that first thought lead, everything begins to align around it. Your emotions follow it. Your focus bends toward it. Your actions start reflecting it. It becomes the lens through which you interpret the rest of the day. And by the time you realize what happened, you are already inside the pattern. Already moving with it. Already seeing through it. But if you interrupt that moment, even once, something changes. Not perfectly. Not all at once. But enough. Instead of merging with the thought, you notice it. Instead of becoming it, you pause and see it. And in that pause, something opens. A small but powerful distance appears between you and the pattern. And inside that distance, you are no longer trapped. You can choose. That is where real inner strength begins. Not when you control every thought, but when you stop treating every thought as who you are. And this is where the idea goes even deeper. Even when people begin to choose their thoughts more carefully, many still lose control in another way. Not through what they think, but through how fast they think. The moment they wake up, their mind is already moving too quickly. It jumps ahead. It starts planning. It begins anticipating problems that have not happened. It runs toward pressure before the day has even started. And because that speed looks organized, it often feels productive. But it is not productivity. It is panic in a cleaner form. It is mental urgency disguised as preparation. And that is how so many people lose their peace before they ever leave the bed. What feels like productivity in the morning is often just panic with a cleaner appearance. The mind starts moving fast, and the body immediately follows. Your breathing gets shorter. Your muscles tighten without you even noticing. Your attention begins jumping from one thing to another, and suddenly you are reacting to a day that has not even begun. This is where most people lose control. They try to keep pace with that speed. They match it. They chase it. They assume that if the mind is rushing, they need to rush with it. But you cannot control something you are busy chasing. That is why the first move is not to speed up. It is to slow down. Not physically at first, but mentally. Let one thought finish before you move to the next. Let the breath settle. Let the mind stop sprinting ahead into imagined problems. And in that stillness, something important begins to return: clarity. Because a calm mind sees. A fast mind reacts. And even after you slow the pace, another problem can quietly take over if you are not careful: noise. Morning noise rarely begins in a dramatic way. It begins with something small. A thought you revisit. A worry you leave unresolved. A distraction you entertain just a little too long. It seems harmless at first, but the mind multiplies what it touches. One thought becomes 5. 5 become 20. And before your feet even touch the floor, your mind already feels crowded. That is the strange thing about mental noise. By the time it fills the room, you often cannot even remember what first opened the door. It takes up space without adding value, and in the morning, space is everything. Whatever fills that inner space early will echo through the rest of your day. It follows you into conversations. It shapes the tone of your decisions. It leaks into moments that actually matter. That is why the most powerful thing you can do is cut it off early. Not by pretending it is not there, not by fighting it, but by noticing it clearly, acknowledging it, and letting it go before it settles in. Because what you feed with attention expands, and what you remove early never gets the chance to take control. This is a principle Stoicism Breath returns to again and again. The morning is not just about what you do. It is about what you allow to stay. And even deeper than noise, there is something more subtle that controls most people without them realizing it: emotion. Not the loud kind. Not the dramatic breakdowns everyone can recognize. The quieter kind. Waking up just a little off. A little anxious. A little heavy. A little unready. And then, without questioning it, allowing the feeling to decide everything that follows. If you feel tired, you move slower. If you feel stressed, you hesitate. If you do not feel ready, you delay. It seems reasonable. It even feels honest. But those feelings are not always accurate. Many times, they are temporary. Just chemistry. Just your nervous system adjusting. Just your body waking up. And the danger begins when you treat those temporary feelings like commands. The moment you obey every feeling, you hand over direction. So instead of reacting to how you feel, you build stability first. Before the world tests you. Before pressure arrives. Before anything external starts demanding something from you. You steady the breath. You ground yourself. You decide how you are going to show up. Not so you can feel perfect, but so you can feel steady. And steadiness matters more than perfection ever will. Because when you are steady, you do not fall apart the moment something goes wrong. You adjust. You recover. You stay with yourself. And once you reach that point, something interesting happens. You realize you do not need more motivation. You do not even need more discipline in the way most people talk about it. What you need is direction. One clear thought is enough. Not 10. Not 20. Just one thought strong enough to carry the day. Something simple, but firm. Something chosen before the world starts choosing for you. You return to that thought again and again until it stops being a sentence you repeat and starts becoming part of how you live. That is when everything else starts to align. Decisions become cleaner. Distractions lose some of their grip. Doubt has less room to spread. One clear direction can organize an entire day better than a mind full of scattered effort. And if you are serious about building that kind of awareness, then staying connected to a space like Stoicism Breath is not just passive watching. It becomes a commitment to thinking more clearly, living more deliberately, and becoming someone who leads his own mind before anything else does. This kind of change does not arrive all at once. It grows gradually, almost quietly, but it grows in a way that compounds. One moment of awareness creates another. One interruption weakens an old pattern and makes room for a new one. Over time, those new patterns begin replacing the old ones. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough to shift the direction of your life. And the more you practice, the clearer this truth becomes. Control is not something you discover later in the day when everything is already moving too fast. It is something you claim early, when things are still quiet, still open, still waiting to be shaped. That is when it is most available. That is when it matters most. So when you wake up tomorrow, before the noise begins, before habit takes over, before your mind starts loading the same old script, notice that one thing. That moment. That silence. That space where nothing has been decided yet. And in that space, ask yourself, slowly, honestly, without rushing past it, what am I allowing to lead me today? Did you choose your first thought this morning, or did it choose you? That single question changes everything, because here's the uncomfortable truth most people avoid. Your mind does not filter for you. It doesn't pause and ask, "Is this helpful?" It doesn't protect you from thoughts that drain your energy. It simply lets everything in. Every unfinished memory, every unresolved fear, every conversation that never found closure, even imagined problems that haven't happened yet, they all find a way to enter, especially in the morning. And in those early moments, when your awareness is still forming, your mind is at its most open. Like a door with no lock, no guard, no system deciding what should enter and what should stay outside. So if you're not standing at that door, even briefly, everything walks in. Not one at a time, not in order, but all at once. And notice this, it's almost never the calm, balanced thoughts that arrive first. It's the heavy ones, the urgent ones, the ones that feel like they demand immediate attention. That's not a flaw. That's how your brain is wired. It scans for threats, for problems, for anything that might require action. Thousands of years ago, that instinct helped you survive. Today, it overwhelms you before your day even begins. You've felt this before. You wake up, and within minutes, something small starts to grow. One thought connects to another, then another, and suddenly your mind feels crowded, tense, and heavy. Not because anything real has happened yet, but because something was allowed to stay. It wasn't questioned. It wasn't filtered. It was accepted. And once it was accepted, it began to spread. This is where the real shift begins. Not by trying to stop thoughts from appearing. That's impossible. Your mind will always generate ideas, memories, scenarios. That's its nature. Trying to silence it completely only creates resistance. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't try to eliminate thoughts. They focused on something far more powerful. What happens after the thought appears? They saw a distinction most people ignore. The difference between a thought arriving and a thought being accepted. One is automatic. The other is a decision. And that decision is where your control lives. Because once a thought is accepted, it doesn't stay alone. It connects. It grows. It starts shaping how you feel, how you interpret situations, how you move through your day. The longer it stays, the stronger it becomes. At first, it spreads quietly, then more aggressively, until it becomes your emotional baseline, your default state. That's why timing matters. Not rushing, not reacting impulsively, but responding early, noticing a thought the moment it appears, and deciding what to do with it before it builds momentum. Imagine this. A thought shows up. Today is going to be stressful. You're not ready. Something will go wrong. It feels real. It feels convincing. It feels like something you should prepare for. But in truth, it's just a suggestion, one of many your mind will offer. And the moment you accept it without question, it begins shaping your behavior. You become more tense, more cautious, more reactive. Not because the day is actually stressful, but because you've already decided that it is. As Marcus Aurelius said, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." And that quality is not determined by what appears in your mind, but by what you choose to keep there. So instead of arguing with these thoughts, instead of trying to fight them or prove them wrong, you do something different. You replace them. Quickly. Intentionally. Not with fake positivity. Not with empty affirmations. But with something stronger. something grounded. Because the longer you engage with a thought that weakens you, the more it strengthens its position in your mind. And once it spreads, it's no longer just a thought, it becomes your state. This is what most people miss. They believe their emotional state just happens to them. Something random. Something they have to deal with later. But most of the time, it started with a single thought that stayed too long. A thought that wasn't challenged, wasn't redirected, wasn't replaced. And over time, something powerful begins to change. Not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. You start noticing thoughts earlier. You become more selective. You stop treating every idea as something you need to follow. Instead, you begin guiding your attention with intention. It becomes less about controlling everything and more about choosing direction. You're no longer forcing your mind to behave. You're deciding what it builds around. And that shift, quiet, subtle, almost invisible, is what changes everything. And here's where everything truly begins to shift, earlier than most people expect. It starts in those first moments of the day, when your mind is still open, still forming, still highly responsive. In that state, even the smallest choices carry real weight. One single thought, handled with awareness, can stop an entire chain reaction before it ever begins. One moment of clarity can interrupt a pattern that has been repeating for years. That's how powerful those early seconds are. So as your day begins, and those first thoughts quietly start to enter, there's a responsibility that comes with awareness. Not the pressure to control everything. Not the impossible task of eliminating every negative thought. But something much simpler and much more powerful, to stand at the door of your mind, even briefly, and choose. To ask yourself, without rushing past it, am I letting my mind collect whatever shows up, or am I deciding what actually gets to stay? Because here's the truth most people overlook. Even when you begin to choose your thoughts more carefully, even when you start noticing what enters and what lingers, there's another challenge that quietly takes over. And it's dangerous precisely because it feels like progress. That challenge is speed. The moment you wake up, your mind often starts moving too fast. Before you've even grounded yourself, it's already jumping ahead, planning, organizing, anticipating everything that could go wrong. It runs through conversations you haven't had yet. It rehearses responsibilities. It builds expectations. It imagines outcomes. And strangely, it feels productive. It feels like you're getting ahead of the day. But you're not. What you're experiencing is not clarity. It's panic, just organized in a way that looks useful. And when your thoughts begin moving at that speed, your body follows whether you realize it or not. Your breathing becomes shorter. Your muscles tighten slightly, then more. Your attention starts scattering, jumping from one thought to the next without ever settling long enough to fully process anything. And suddenly, before the day has even truly started, you are already reacting. Not to reality, but to a version of reality your mind has created at high speed. You're trying to solve problems that don't exist yet, preparing for outcomes that may never happen, burning energy before you've even taken your first real step into the day. And most people respond to this in the same way. They try to keep up. They push themselves to think faster, move faster, act faster. They match the pace of their thoughts instead of questioning it. But here's the problem. You cannot control something you are chasing. The faster your mind runs, the less control you actually have. It pulls you forward. It drags your attention. It begins to dictate your emotional state. And the more you try to keep up, the more you train your mind to believe that this speed is normal, that this constant urgency is necessary. This is where the real difference begins to show, not in how much you do, but in how you start. The Stoics understood something most people miss. Control does not come from matching the speed of your thoughts. It comes from stepping out of that speed entirely. They didn't rush into thinking the moment they woke up. They didn't allow their mind to sprint ahead. Instead, they slowed down first, deliberately. Even when life demanded urgency, even when responsibilities were waiting, not physically, but mentally, they allowed the mind to settle before asking it to perform, one thought at a time, one breath at a time, not because they had nothing to do, but because they understood something simple and profound. A calm mind sees clearly, while a fast mind only reacts. When your mind is moving too quickly, everything feels urgent. Everything feels important. And when everything feels important, you lose the ability to tell what actually matters. You move quickly, but without direction. You act, but without clarity. You respond, but without understanding. Slowing down interrupts that cycle. It creates space. Space between thoughts. Space where you can observe instead of immediately reacting. Space where you can decide instead of being carried. And in that space, something powerful begins to return, not control over everything, but control over yourself. And in that space, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your breathing slows down. Your body softens just a little. Your attention, which was scattered just moments ago, begins to settle and focus. You're no longer being dragged forward by every thought that appears. Instead, you're standing with your thoughts, observing them, choosing how to respond. That is real control. And it doesn't come from doing more, pushing harder, or thinking faster. It comes from doing less, but with intention. As Seneca once said, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it." And that waste doesn't only show up in big life decisions or obvious distractions. It shows up right here, in these quiet moments, when your mind is racing through possibilities instead of settling into what's actually in front of you. When you spend energy reacting to imagined futures instead of directing your attention to the present moment, you're already giving away control without realizing it. So instead of asking yourself, "What do I need to get done today?" there's a deeper, more important question to consider first. Why is my mind rushing? Because that speed is not random. It's coming from somewhere. Pressure, expectations, habit, fear. Something is pushing your thoughts to move faster than they need to. And until you recognize that source, you'll keep trying to manage the speed itself instead of addressing what's driving it. You'll keep trying to keep up instead of stepping back. But the moment you notice it, you gain the ability to interrupt it. Not by forcing your mind to stop. That never works. But by slowing the pace of your attention. Let one thought finish before jumping to the next. Let one breath settle before taking another. It might feel unnatural at first, almost uncomfortable, because you're used to constant stimulation, constant movement, constant noise. But it's in that stillness that clarity begins to return. Because here's what most people don't see. Your mind is designed to connect everything. One thought becomes 5. 5 become 20. Not because you chose to expand them, but because your brain automatically builds associations. It pulls in related memories, similar fears, past experiences that carry the same emotional tone. And before you even realize what's happening, your mind feels full, not with clarity, not with direction, but with noise. And the most frustrating part? You often can't even trace it back. You feel the weight. You feel distracted. You feel unfocused. But you can't remember where it started. That's how noise works. It doesn't need a clear beginning to take over. It just needs space. And once it finds that space, it fills it completely, without adding anything useful in return. This is why the morning matters more than you think. Because your mind is still forming its direction. It hasn't fully committed to a state yet. It's still flexible, still open, still responsive. And whatever fills that space early doesn't stay contained to that moment. It echoes. It carries forward into everything else. How you speak, how you listen, how you make decisions, how you react under pressure. It becomes part of your baseline, without you ever consciously choosing it. So what ends up happening? Most people carry that noise with them throughout the day. They don't always notice it directly, but they feel its effects. They walk into conversations already distracted, already partially somewhere else. They make decisions without full clarity. They move through important moments only half present, split between what's happening in front of them and what's looping inside their mind. And because it's internal, because no one else can see it, they assume that's just how life feels. But it doesn't have to be. The Stoics understood something essential. They didn't try to eliminate thoughts completely. They knew the mind will always generate ideas, concerns, possibilities. That's part of being human. What they focused on instead was catching that noise early. Not when it becomes overwhelming. Not when it's already taken over. But when it's still small enough to handle. They didn't ignore it, because ignoring doesn't work. What you ignore often comes back stronger. Instead, they acknowledged it. They saw it clearly for what it was, a passing thought, not a command, not a truth, not something that deserves endless attention. And in that simple act of noticing without feeding, it loses its power. That is the quiet discipline Stoicism Breath invites you to practice. Not controlling everything, not silencing your mind, but learning to recognize what deserves your attention and what never needed it in the first place. And the moment they recognize that noise, they didn't sit with it, analyze it, or try to understand every layer of it. They let it go immediately, not later, not after it had time to grow, right when it appeared. Because every second you spend engaging with unnecessary thoughts is a second you're feeding them. And whatever you feed grows. That's the part most people overlook. It's not the thought itself that creates the problem. It's the attention you give it. Attention is fuel. It takes something small and turns it into something persistent. It gives it energy. It gives it space. It gives it importance. And once a thought is all three, it becomes harder to remove, not because it was ever that powerful to begin with, but because you made it that way. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And that estimate begins internally. It begins in how much attention you give to something that may not deserve it. The moment you invest your attention, you begin shaping your experience around it, even if the original thought had no real significance at all." So cutting off noise isn't about suppressing thoughts or pretending they don't exist. That only creates resistance. It's about something much simpler and much more powerful, refusing to invest in them, recognizing when a thought doesn't move you forward, when it doesn't add clarity, when it doesn't serve your direction, and choosing, consciously, not to give it more time than it deserves. And when you make that choice early, before the thought multiplies, you protect something far more valuable than most people realize: clarity. Because clarity is fragile in the morning. It hasn't fully formed yet. It can be shaped, but it can also be crowded out. So as your day begins and thoughts start to appear, there's a quiet decision happening again and again. It's not dramatic. It's not obvious. But it's constant. A thought enters, and instead of following it automatically, you pause, just long enough to see it clearly. And then you decide, does this deserve my attention? Or is this something that never needed to stay in the first place? That single pause is where everything begins to change. But even when you learn to clear noise, even when you start filtering your thoughts and interrupting patterns, there's something deeper that still controls most people. And it's harder to recognize because it doesn't feel like something you can influence. Emotion. Not the obvious kind. Not the intense reactions everyone can clearly see. The subtle ones. The quiet background feelings that shape your entire day without asking for permission. The slight heaviness when you wake up. The low-level anxiety that has no clear reason. The subtle lack of energy that makes everything feel just a little harder than it should. These feelings don't demand your attention, but they guide your behavior anyway. Most people don't question them. They accept them as truth, as reality, as something that defines how their day will unfold. And it shows up in small, almost invisible ways. If you feel tired, you move slower. If you feel stressed, you hesitate. If you don't feel ready, you delay. It feels logical. It feels honest. It feels like you're responding to reality. But what if you're not? What if that internal state isn't actually accurate? What if it's just temporary? Just your body waking up? Just your chemistry rebalancing? Just your mind transitioning from rest to awareness? Something that feels real, but isn't necessarily reliable. That's where the real difference begins. Because the moment you treat every feeling like a command, you give it authority over your actions. You let it decide how you move, how you respond, how much effort you give. And without realizing it, you start building your entire day around something that was never meant to lead in the first place. A passing state becomes a defining force, not because it's strong, but because it was never questioned. The Stoics approached this differently. They didn't deny emotions. They didn't pretend they didn't exist. And they didn't try to suppress them completely. What they understood was something far more useful. Emotions are signals, not instructions. They appear. They communicate something. But they don't get to decide what happens next, unless you allow them to. And that distinction changes everything. Because the moment you observe a feeling instead of immediately reacting to it, you create space. A small gap between what you feel and what you do. And inside that space is where your freedom begins. And in that small space you create between you and your emotions, something powerful begins to happen. You start to separate yourself from what you feel, even if only slightly. You begin to recognize that what you're experiencing is temporary, something passing through you, not something that defines you. And in that awareness, you gain something most people never realize they have, the ability to choose your response instead of being carried away by the feeling. As Epictetus once said, "No man is free who is not master of himself." And that kind of mastery doesn't come from eliminating emotions. It comes from not being controlled by them. It comes from understanding a simple but life-changing truth. Just because you feel something doesn't mean you have to act on it. This becomes especially important in the morning, when your emotional state is still forming, when everything is open, flexible, and easily shaped. Because if you let your emotions take the lead during that fragile window, they don't just influence a moment, they set the tone for your entire day. Think about it. A slight anxiety in the morning can quietly turn into constant tension. A small sense of heaviness can grow into a lack of motivation that follows you for hours. Not because those feelings were ever accurate, but because they were given control too early, before you had the chance to question them. So instead of trying to feel better immediately, instead of forcing positivity or pretending everything is fine, the focus shifts to something deeper and far more effective: building stability before anything tests you. Before the day demands your attention. Before challenges arise. Before pressure shows up. You create a baseline. Something steady. Something grounded. Something that doesn't depend on how you happen to wake up feeling. And this stability doesn't require complicated routines or extreme discipline. It can come from simple, intentional actions. Sitting quietly with your thoughts without reacting to them. Slowing your breathing just enough to bring your body back into balance. Taking a moment to decide, clearly, how you're going to show up today before anything else decides it for you. These small actions don't make you perfect. They make you steady. And that steadiness changes everything. Because when something goes wrong later in the day, and it will, you're no longer starting from zero. You're not reacting from chaos or instability. You're responding from a foundation you've already built. That doesn't mean you won't feel stress. It doesn't mean you won't feel pressure. But it does mean you won't collapse under it. You adjust. You stay grounded. You move forward anyway. And that is the difference most people never learn. Most people wake up and wait to see how they feel before deciding how they act. They let their internal state dictate their behavior. And because their feelings constantly change, their actions become inconsistent. One day they're focused. The next day they hesitate. Not because anything meaningful changed, but because their emotions did. But when you build stability first, something shifts. Your direction stays the same, even when your feelings don't. You stop acting based on emotion and start acting based on intention. And over time, that completely changes your relationship with your inner world. You stop fearing your emotions. You stop relying on them. You stop treating them like instructions. Instead, you begin to see them for what they truly are: signals that move, shift, and pass, but don't need to control you. So instead of asking yourself, "How do I feel this morning?" a question that keeps you reacting, you begin asking something far more powerful. What state do I need to be in today? Because that question changes everything. It shifts you from observation to creation. From reacting to building. From being led to leading. And in that shift, you take your power back. Not in a heavy, overwhelming way, but in a clear, grounded way that gives your day direction before anything else has the chance to take it away. That is where real control begins. And from that moment, everything begins to change, quietly, steadily, without force. You start building toward that chosen state with intention. Not rushing. Not pushing. Just aligning your thoughts, your breathing, your focus with the direction you've already decided. And as you do this, something subtle but powerful happens. That initial feeling that once seemed so important begins to lose its grip. It doesn't disappear completely. It doesn't magically vanish. But it fades into the background. Not because it's gone, but because it no longer has control. And that's where real consistency begins. Not in eliminating emotions. Not in feeling perfect every morning. But in becoming steady enough to move forward, regardless of how you feel. As the morning unfolds and those subtle emotions begin to surface, the slight anxiety, the low energy, the quiet tension, you reach a moment where you can pause. A moment where you can shift your approach. Not by ignoring what you feel. Not by fighting it. But by recognizing it without giving it authority. Because the real question isn't, how do I feel right now? The real question is, what am I going to build from here? And this is where most people lose control again. They wake up with good intentions. They want to be sharper, more disciplined, more focused. So they try to fix everything at once. More control over their thoughts. More motivation. More structure. More effort. It feels productive. It sounds like progress. But in reality, it's overload. And the mind doesn't respond well to overload, even when it's positive. Instead of becoming clear, it fragments. It gets pulled in multiple directions. It tries to hold onto everything at once, and ends up committing to nothing. You've probably felt this before, starting the day with energy, but losing it within hours because there was no clear direction holding it together. Because here's the truth most people miss. The mind doesn't need more. It needs direction. Not 10 different ideas competing for attention. Not a long list of expectations creating pressure before the day even begins. Just one clear thought. One anchor. Something simple enough to hold on to, but strong enough to guide everything else. And this is where simplicity becomes power. Most people believe that more effort equals more control. But the opposite is often true. Real control comes from clarity. And clarity doesn't come from adding more. It comes from narrowing down. One thought is enough. Not because it solves everything instantly, but because it organizes everything around it. The Stoics understood this deeply. They didn't try to manage every thought that entered their mind. They didn't try to control every emotional reaction or predict every possible outcome. Instead, they chose a single principle, a guiding idea, and allowed everything else to align around it. That choice created structure. That structure created consistency. And that consistency created control. And the beauty of it is this: your anchor doesn't have to be complicated. It can be something simple. Stay calm under pressure. Finish what you start. Keep your focus no matter what shows up. The exact words don't matter. What matters is that it resonates with you, that it feels real, that it's something you can return to when your attention starts drifting, when distractions pull at you, when doubt begins to creep in. Because the moment you choose that thought, you're doing something most people never do. You're deciding who you're going to be before the day has a chance to decide for you. And that decision changes everything. Without it, your mind drifts. It reacts to whatever is in front of it. It adjusts constantly, based on circumstances, emotions, distractions. One moment you're focused, the next you're not. One moment you feel confident, the next uncertain. Not because anything truly changed, but because there was no anchor holding you steady. But once that anchor is in place, something shifts. You're no longer reacting to everything equally. You're filtering your actions through intention. When a distraction appears, it doesn't automatically pull you away, because you have something to return to. When doubt shows up, it doesn't take over as easily, because your direction is already set. As Seneca once said, "If a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable." And that applies here more than ever. When you don't choose your direction, everything can pull you off course. But when you do, when you decide clearly, intentionally, your mind begins to organize itself around that decision. And that is where true control begins. If a man knows not to which port he sails, no wind is favorable. And that truth doesn't just apply to the outside world. It applies even more to what's happening inside your mind. Because when your mind has no clear direction, everything begins to pull at you. Every thought, every distraction, every emotion has the power to shift you off course. One notification, one worry, one random impulse, and suddenly your focus is gone. Not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline, but because there was no direction holding you steady in the first place. But the moment that direction is set, something changes. It doesn't mean distractions disappear. It doesn't mean emotions stop showing up. But they lose their power to control you. They're no longer deciding where you go, you are. And this is where repetition becomes powerful. Not forced repetition, not mechanical routines, but intentional return. You come back to that one thought again and again throughout the morning, not because you forgot it, but because you're strengthening it. You're allowing it to settle deeper, to move from something you simply say into something you actually believe, and eventually into something you act on without even thinking. At first, it takes effort. You catch yourself drifting. You bring your attention back. You realign. You remind yourself again. But over time, something shifts. That thought starts showing up on its own, exactly when you need it. In moments of distraction, in moments of doubt, in moments where your focus begins to slip. It becomes part of how you think, not just something you repeat. And once that happens, your decisions begin to feel different. You hesitate less. You second-guess less. You move with more clarity. Because you're no longer starting from uncertainty, you're acting from something already established within you. Distractions begin to lose their intensity, not because they're gone, but because they don't match the direction you've chosen. Doubt may still appear, but it doesn't take up the same space, because it doesn't align with the identity you're building. And that's the deeper layer most people never see. This isn't just about having a better morning. It's about shaping who you become over time. Because the thoughts you repeat consistently don't just influence your actions, they define how you see yourself. And how you see yourself determines how you act. So instead of trying to fix everything at once, instead of overwhelming yourself with more pressure, more expectations, more complexity, you simplify. You choose one thought. You hold on to it. You return to it whenever your mind drifts. And you let it guide your actions, quietly, consistently, without force. Because when everything is scattered, progress feels random. But when everything is aligned, even the smallest actions begin to build in the same direction. And that's where real momentum comes from. So as your day begins and your mind starts to move, there's a moment, small, almost invisible, where you can decide your direction. Not with a long list. Not with complicated plans. But with one clear idea you're willing to carry with you. And once that decision is made, everything else begins to organize itself around it. So the question becomes simple, but powerful. What is the one thought you're building your entire day on? Now imagine this. You create a boundary, not for the world, but for yourself. A quiet line in time that most people never define. Let's say it's 7 a.m. Before that moment, you belong to yourself. Your thoughts are still flexible. Your attention hasn't been claimed. Your state hasn't been shaped by the outside world. But once that moment passes, everything changes. The world begins to ask for you. Messages, responsibilities, conversations, pressure, demands that pull you outward, whether you're ready or not. And most people never define that boundary. So their mornings drift. 1 minute turns into 10, 10 into 30. They stay in bed a little longer, scroll a little more, think without structure, delay without noticing. They tell themselves, "I'll focus later. I'll get it together once the day starts." But later never comes the way they expect. Because once the day begins, it doesn't slow down for you. It doesn't pause so you can catch up. It keeps moving, and you enter it in whatever state you happen to wake up in. And that state is rarely intentional. Without a boundary, you don't prepare, you react. You don't decide, you adjust. You don't lead your day, you follow whatever demands your attention first. Not because you lack discipline, but because you never chose your direction when it mattered most. And that is the difference between drifting through your day and actually taking control of it. And the truth is, it's not that you lack discipline, it's that you never created the moment where discipline was required. You never forced a decision before everything else began. And that's where most people go wrong. Because the Stoics never relied on motivation to fix this. They didn't wait until they felt ready, inspired, or energized. They understood something most people ignore. Motivation is unreliable. It fades. It shifts. It disappears exactly when you need it most. So instead of depending on motivation, they created something far more powerful. They created internal pressure. Not the kind that stresses you out, but the kind that anchors you. A boundary. A moment in time that cannot be negotiated with, a line where the work simply must be done. And here's the key: what they did in that moment wasn't complicated. It wasn't about perfection. It wasn't about becoming some ideal version of themselves overnight. It was about alignment. Making sure that before the world asked anything from them, they had already handled what was within their control. Their mind clear enough. Their emotions steady enough. Their direction chosen. Not perfect, not complete, just ready. And that readiness is what separates someone who reacts from someone who leads. Because once that line is crossed, once the day begins, there's no going back to prepare. You're already in motion, already responding, already making decisions. And if you didn't take control beforehand, you're now trying to build control while everything around you is moving. And that is always harder. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think." That idea isn't meant to create fear. It creates clarity. It reminds you that time, especially in the morning, is limited. It's not something you can assume will always be there. And what you do with that time sets the tone for everything that follows. So when you create a boundary like this, something shifts internally. You stop negotiating with yourself. No more. Just 5 more minutes. No more. I'll do it later. You begin to understand this window matters. It has a purpose. And because of that, your actions become intentional. You stop drifting and start deciding. You get up and handle what needs to be handled. You slow your mind before it has a chance to race. You clear out what doesn't belong. You stabilize what feels uncertain. And you choose the direction you're going to carry into the day. Not because you feel like it, but because you've decided it matters. And when you do this consistently, something powerful begins to change. You stop entering your day in a reactive state. You stop feeling like you're constantly catching up. Instead, you start from control. Even if it's not perfect. Even if it's still developing. That foundation carries forward into everything else. When something unexpected happens, you don't fall apart as easily because you didn't start from instability. When pressure builds, you don't get overwhelmed as quickly because you created space before the day began. When distractions appear, they don't pull you as far away because your direction was already set. And that's the point. This isn't about eliminating challenges. It's about not being unprepared for them. And preparation doesn't require hours. It doesn't require complexity. It requires a line. A moment where you decide, before this point, I take control of what is mine. Because without that line, everything stays optional. And when something is optional, it's easy to delay, easy to ignore, easy to push aside. But when there is a boundary, there is clarity. No negotiation. No hesitation. Just action. And over time, this becomes part of who you are. You don't wait to feel ready. You make sure you are. So as that moment approaches each morning, As time moves closer to when the world begins to demand your attention, there is a decision waiting for you. Not later. Not eventually. Right then. Because once that line is crossed, everything that follows is built on what you did before it. So ask yourself honestly, what happens if you don't take control before the world does? Because the way you begin your day quietly shapes the way you live your life. Not in dramatic ways, but in small decisions, in steady thoughts, in moments where you either lead or get pulled. And over time, those moments become your identity. So if something in you is ready to take that control back, don't stop here. There's another video on your screen right now that will take you deeper, helping you strengthen this mindset and turn it into something real. Go watch it next. And thank you for being part of Stoicism Breath.